Scholars in the Middle Ages were committed to the use of logical argument in the pursuit of truth. Today, we're going to explore how they used logical argument in pursuit of the ultimate question, whether God exists. How did they use reason to demonstrate that? Join me today for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last time we looked at the development of the university system and the indispensable role that the Catholic Church played. We saw how the popes played a critical role in protecting the students and fostering university life, and even making possible an international scholarly community. Now, these days, unfortunately, the Church is rarely, if ever, given credit for these things, but I assure you, everything I'm telling you is based on sources that are easily consulted. Pick up a history of the university, and you'll read this for yourself. Today, I want to pursue this avenue of inquiry even further. I want to introduce some important personalities and look at things they did and said, and the questions they pursued. And in particular, I want to take two famous people in church history and look at how they answered the critical question, can we prove the existence of God? And if so, how? Now that's very unfashionable today, because today, as I said at the beginning, we're being bombarded by arguments by, frankly, militant atheists who claim that it's irrational to believe in God, that of course a critical, scientific-minded thinker could never believe in God. Well, I hope to convince you otherwise today. Well, first, let's begin with a few personalities. It is worth noting that in the Middle Ages, there was a commitment to logical argument and a belief that logic and reason could lead you to the truth. In fact, Pope John the 21st wrote a book on logic, and his textbook was used for centuries afterward and went through 166 printings. Very, very few books go through that many printings. And here is a pope, a future pope, writing a book of that nature. Now, more specifically, a fellow named Peter Abelardo was a scholar who died around 1142. He was controversial in his day, but he paved the way for scholars who came after him. Abelardo was known particularly for a book he wrote, in Latin is known as Sic et Non. Literally means yes and no. Because what Abelardo did was he took apparent contradictions, for example, apparently contradictory biblical verses, or apparently contradictory statements from church fathers, and he deliberately juxtaposed them so that they were right next to each other on the page. And there you were, face to face with an apparent contradiction. How would that contradiction be resolved? Well, the reason that Abelard's book was a bit scandalous for his time was that he didn't answer that question. He left the apparent contradictions just hanging there. And the reason he did this is he said, I'm a teacher for a living, and I'm not going to do my students' work for them. His students had the task of reconciling these apparent contradictions. So I always get a kick out of it when young students in college would come up to me and say, well, aren't there a lot of contradictions in the Bible? Ho, ho, ho. Well, Peter Abelardo was talking about this in the 12th century and was using reason to try to resolve them, so I don't think I need some kid from Long Island to tell me this. But Peter Abelard's point was that when you have two sources, both of which are authoritative, biblical verses, for example, church fathers, but they seem to be saying different things, how can you resolve this matter? You can't resolve it by an appeal to authority, because here you have two authorities that are saying different things. So how do we resolve it? Through the use of reason. Because Peter Abelardo was convinced that truth could not contradict itself, that these contradictions must be only apparent contradictions, and that once we get beneath the surface, we'll find that in fact the statements can be perfectly well reconciled. For instance, perhaps the two speakers or the two verses are speaking about the same issue under different aspects. Or perhaps one of the quotations is taken out of context. Whatever the explanation, Peter Abelard was certain that there was one. So here was a scholar who was absolutely prepared to take apparent intellectual difficulties in the faith and arbitrate them at the bar of human reason. Now that is pretty much exactly the opposite impression that I think people have about the Catholic Church, is it not? Then we have a fellow named Peter Lombard. He lived from about 1100 to 1160, who wrote a work of theology called the Sentences that became the most studied theological text, apart from the Bible, for the next several centuries. Now, Lombard, in his book, used authority to explain various aspects of the faith, but he did not hesitate also to appeal to human reason in order better to understand and explore the mysteries of our faith. Again, more or less the opposite of what we're told, isn't it? This, in a nutshell, is what we call scholasticism. In some ways, it's hard to define scholasticism in a way that every single scholastic would qualify as one. But I think it's safe to say that scholasticism initially began as a term simply to refer to professors who taught in universities. Now, right away, that would exclude St. Anselm, because he didn't teach in a university, but he was a scholastic, so it doesn't always work. But beyond that, the scholastics typically were interested in the use of reason in order to understand better and to defend the Catholic faith. They believed that there was no contradiction between reason and faith, and that if there appeared to be one, then we had simply misused our reason, we had not correctly argued the matter, or we simply understood some aspect of the faith. But the two could not contradict each other. They were two wings, in effect, that would soar toward the truth. I believe that's how Pope John Paul II put it in his encyclical Fides et Ratio in the late 1990s. That's exactly what St. Thomas Aquinas believed. So the scholastics are committed to this project of the use of reason in the pursuit of truth and in entertaining opposing views. Typically, particularly after the 13th century, a scholastic didn't just get up there, give his position, and sit down. He always anticipated what the other side would say. And as I said, St. Thomas Aquinas was so generous to his opponents that he would not only explain their position very persuasively, but he would sometimes think of arguments that his own opponents hadn't even thought of, and he would come up with those arguments and say, here, you can have these arguments, but I'm going to answer those too. That's typical of scholasticism. Well, let's look at a well-known early scholastic, a figure we've looked at briefly already, St. Anselm. He's a very early scholastic. He dies around 1109. St. Anselm was interested in this question: does God exist, and can we prove that God exists? Now, it's true, over the course of his career, St. Anselm asked and answered a great many questions. But this one, perhaps more than any other, established him as a philosopher, because even if people didn't accept his argument, from then on, people at least had to reckon with it, one way or the other. You had to at least show why you didn't agree with him. St. Anselm, in effect, argued as follows. It's just a very few steps that he took to try to prove through reason alone that God exists. And his first claim is as follows, that regardless of whether you agree with me that God exists, we can certainly agree on a definition of God. God is the greatest conceivable being. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That was how he put it. So there's our first statement. God's the greatest conceivable being. Our second statement is the greatest conceivable being has to be absolutely perfect, has to be perfect in every way, has to possess every possible perfection. I don't think that's particularly controversial. That follows from the first statement. Now, the third statement goes like this. It's more perfect if you exist both in reality and in the mind than if you exist only in the mind. Now, that might sound a little tricky, so I'll give you a good example. Suppose you're thinking in your mind about a hot fudge sundae, but it doesn't exist in reality. There is no hot fudge sundae in the room. It's only in your mind. I think we would all agree that that hot fudge sundae is not as perfect as a hot fudge sundae that is both in your mind and right on the table in front of you. It has a perfection by existing in the world that the imaginary Sunday does not have. Well, what does this have to do with God? Well, what St. Anselm is saying is, suppose God exists only in our minds. He's just a figment of our imagination, like the non-existent hot fudge sundae. Well, then that being is not as perfect as a being who existed both in our minds and also in reality. Now, his next step, in effect, is, therefore God exists. Now, it might seem like he's maybe skipping a few steps here. How does he get there? Well, his point is, if we've said that God's the greatest conceivable being, he has every possible perfection, and one perfection is to exist in reality, the greatest conceivable being would have to have that perfection. He would have to exist in reality, or he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being if he were only in your mind. But we already agreed that he is. Therefore, God exists. Now, in effect, what St. Anselm is saying is that the existence of God is implied in the very definition of God. Once we unpack that definition, what do we find? We find that his existence is immediately implied. In the same way that if we really understand what the number 9 is, then what follows from the definition of 9 is that its square root has to be 3. Once we've fully understood the concept of 9, we understand its square root is 3. Well, likewise, once we fully understand the definition of God, we then see that part of his nature is to exist. He has to exist. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not so sure that one works, that seems a little bit slippery, I will point out that most philosophers have in fact rejected St. Anselm's proof. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas rejected St. Anselm's proof, as a matter of fact. But there's always been, in the Western philosophical tradition, a minority tradition that has accepted Anselm's proof. And, in fact, very recently, a dear friend of mine, Bill Mara, who died in 1998, he taught philosophy at Fordham for decades. And he absolutely believed that Anselm's proof works. But whether you believe it or not, for our purposes, is not so important. What I simply want to show you is that Anselm and other Catholics were committed to the pursuit of truth through human reason. There is nothing scriptural in that argument from St. Anselm. He wanted to show that the human mind could solve this problem. Well, after the break, we're going to see how St. Thomas Aquinas solved this problem, and I think much more persuasively. So join me after the break.